Today, we're talking about the four types of AI that business leaders need to know. When most business leaders and executives talk about AI, they're mostly thinking about things like ChatGPT, maybe some copilots, AI agents running in the background. If those are the only types of AI that you're thinking about, you're probably missing 80% of the value that AI can bring to your business. My name is Joshua Ebner. I've spent 20 years in AI, machine learning, and data science, including at companies like Apple. And this is a very common mistake that I'm seeing right now. So in this video, I'm going to explain the four types of AI that you need to know: what they are, how they work, their strengths and weaknesses, and maybe most importantly, when you should use them to solve specific types of business problems. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about the type of AI that's created more value for businesses than almost any other type of AI in history, and that's predictive AI. Now, predictive AI, as the name implies, focuses on making predictions. This is important, though. It's an important distinction to make between things like ChatGPT, meaning generative AI, and predictive AI. Generative AI, which we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes, can make predictions. So you can go to ChatGPT and give it some data and ask it to sort of make some predictions, but it's generally not very good at that. It's often very imprecise, sometimes quite inaccurate. And even if you can build a predictive model with a generative AI system, it often costs quite a bit more to run than a traditional predictive AI system. Having said that, let me talk very briefly about what it is and kind of how it works. Predictive AI makes either numeric predictions or categorical predictions. So, with making numerical predictions, it's predicting things like sales forecasts, inventory forecasts. It's predicting a number. We also have a type that makes predictions about categories. We call this classification, and it's sort of like multiple choice. We give a model some data, and then we say choose among these two or three or five different possible categories that we predetermine in advance. This can be very useful for certain types of marketing applications, operations, but in marketing, where I've actually used it quite a bit, we can use it for things like churn prediction and upsell propensity models. So if you're trying to figure out who's likely to churn out of your business, if you have, let's say, a subscription program, month by month, they're making monthly payments, you're trying to figure out and identify who's likely to churn so you can retain those customers. You can build a predictive model that figures out who's likely to churn. You can do the same thing for upsell propensity if you have different tiers in your business. And most businesses should have tiers or tiered pricing if you want to optimize your revenue. But if someone's at, let's say, a basic pricing level and you want to figure out if they're ready to upgrade to a premium level, you can build a model that can predict those people and then create processes and systems to reach out to those individuals, maybe with sales calls or additional marketing efforts, to try and incentivize or motivate those individuals to, in fact, upgrade. These types of predictive systems can help generate revenue by increasing customer retention, which means that a person will remain a customer longer, increasing customer lifetime value. Or if you're using an upsell propensity model, it can, again, increase your revenue per customer, by getting them to upgrade to a higher service level at a higher price point. So those are only two examples in the marketing context, but you can use classification systems across operations and finance, security, all over the place. By the way, if you want to know if your company is really ready to use AI, click the link in the description below. Go take my AI readiness assessment. It's 15 questions. It'll take you less than 3 minutes, and it will score you on 3 major areas that will tell you your AI readiness. Click on the link in the description and take the AI readiness assessment right now. So predictive AI obviously is excellent at making predictions. It doesn't generate text. It's often pretty bad at finding patterns in data, although we can use predictive models to figure out the drivers of certain behavior. I actually did this when I was at some very large corporations, trying to figure out what the drivers were of customer dissatisfaction. You can actually use predictive models for that. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that if you need to make predictions in your business, and there are a variety of different areas in a business where making predictions can be extremely useful or valuable, if you need to make predictions, you're probably going to want to use a predictive AI system rather than a generative one like ChatGPT. Having said that, even though predictive AI is excellent at making predictions, it's not always the best tool for finding useful patterns in your data. And that brings us to our next type of AI, exploratory AI. So, exploratory AI is excellent at finding patterns in data. Now, one thing that I want to note here is that this is sort of an unconventional term for this type of AI. Traditionally, in the industry, we call this unsupervised learning. But for these purposes, I like to call it exploratory AI because it helps you, if you use it right, it helps you explore your data and find patterns. This can be very useful for strategic purposes, especially in the context of marketing and product. So I've used this many times in the past at large banks, large tech firms, FANG companies. Using this technique, you can find patterns in your data that help you understand your customers and then generate better strategies for those customers. So there's a very specific technique that I have in mind here, one called segmentation, which is very common in marketing and product. So in segmentation, you take a very large group of customers and then divide it into smaller subsegments. And then you analyze those individual segments and figure out what they like, what they dislike, which channels they prefer, what their needs, their desires, their preferences are, the sort of psychological architecture. And once you use this segmentation technique, this exploratory AI technique to understand those different segments, then you can build marketing and product strategies that are specifically for those segments. Again, this is used in huge companies, banks, FANG companies, and that's one type of exploratory AI among many different ones that you can use. So if you're trying to find previously unseen patterns, you're generally going to use exploratory AI. Now, one caveat here, you can use generative AI to find some patterns in your data. If you have a few pages or you have some rows of data in a spreadsheet, you can sometimes take that and drop it into the context window of ChatGPT or Claude, and it can give you some very powerful insights. The problem is that those insights are sometimes a little bit imprecise, and that process often fails to scale properly. So if you only have a little bit of data, ChatGPT and generative AI can be very useful for exploring, but if you want to scale that up and get a lot more precise, there are other types of exploratory AI that can often do that quite a bit better. Next, let's move on to kind of the big one. It's something that I've already mentioned a few times, and it's maybe the most popular right now. And it's a very powerful AI technique, but it does have its own limitations. Here, I'm talking about generative AI. So, generative AI is probably the one that you're really familiar with. It's the one that everyone's been talking about for the last couple of years. Things like ChatGPT and Claude, those are text based generative AI. They generate text. We also now have video generators and image generators. These all kind of fall under the umbrella of generative AI. Now, these are very powerful techniques. They have strengths, but they also do have weaknesses. Generative AI, specifically when we're talking about text based LLMs, large language models, these generate text based outputs. They also generally take text based inputs. So you can go to the context window, type in a query or a prompt of some type, and it will give you a response. Now, the strengths are they're excellent at generating text. They can generate things like emails, marketing copy. You can use these for question and answer sessions. Almost everyone is doing this now. You can also use it for document summarization and translation. The problem comes when people try and use it maybe a little bit too much and try and use it beyond its capabilities. These models, as many people are familiar with now, tend to hallucinate. They will give you incorrect answers very confidently. Another issue that many executives are running into right now is that large language models, when you're using them for advice, often give you a pretty good answer, but almost never an excellent answer. So, what I'm personally seeing is if I go to ChatGPT and ask it a question, it will usually give me enough information to get me 80% of the way there. But then if I want to get it from 80% to 95 or 97%, if I want it to be really excellent, whatever I'm doing, it will often give me kind of a wrong answer or it will kind of send me in circles. People are seeing this with advice or writing code. It'll often give you enough code to kind of get it most of the way there. But then there's a bug, you ask it to fix a bug and it fixes it, but then it creates a new bug somewhere else. It tends to do this a lot. So that's one kind of limitation. Another problem is if you're using generative AI to make predictions, like I said previously, generative AI tends to make somewhat imprecise predictions and it tends to make a lot more mistakes. So if you're trying to use generative AI for everything and you think that generative AI is going to solve all of your problems, you're likely to be a little bit disappointed. And that's why I want you to understand some of the other techniques that we've talked about previously, as well as the one that is coming up in just a minute. So overall, you should be using generative AI, I think mostly for knowledge work, document summarization, writing first drafts of marketing copy, email copy. You can use it a little bit for things like document editing and contract review. Please talk to your lawyer though, and be very careful with this. This is not legal advice, but you can use this for a lot of knowledge work, but it's only going to get you so far, at least as of today. You also need to spend a lot of time writing good prompts. Prompting and context generation is a skill in and of itself. And you often, as I've sort of suggested, need to spend a lot of time validating or verifying the outputs to make sure that they are appropriate and useful for your purposes. This actually requires subject matter expertise. So, one thing that I do recommend is that you invest a lot in subject matter experts. They're going to be the ones that are going to get the most value out of using generative AI and large language models for knowledge work. Now, generative AI is good at a variety of different tasks in business, and it's sort of good at a variety of different things in knowledge work. But if you want to automate your workflows, you're going to need a different type of AI, and that's agentic AI. So, agentic AI is kind of another word for AI agents. And everyone, especially in the last year or so, has been talking about AI agents. Let me very quickly explain what they are, and then we'll kind of get into the details of where they're strong and weak. So, an AI agent is actually typically built with a large language model at its core. So, it is built on top of generative AI. But we take a large language model and then give it access to a couple of different things. First, you need to give it access to memory. Typically, you have short term memory, which is both in the context window itself, the past conversations, things like that. Short term memory is mostly the context itself and past conversations. So if you've had past conversations with ChatGPT and it seems to remember those things, that's a sort of short term memory. There's also long term memory by giving it access to databases and what we call vector stores, stores of documents that are stored in a particular way. If you give an AI system access to databases and document stores, that's more of a form of long term memory. There's a couple of other ways of doing long term memory too, things like specialized training or fine tuning of a model. I'll talk about that in a separate video. We're also often going to give an AI agent access to tools. So things like calculators, spreadsheets, maybe other types of AI like predictive systems, little software tools and APIs, stuff like that. And by giving an AI agent access both to memory and tools, you give it more capabilities and more capacity to do work. And what happens is the large language model acts like a reasoning or planning engine. It makes plans and then uses the tools and memory that it has to solve problems and do work. Now, the good news is that in the long term, I think that these are going to be enormous productivity enhancers. Many people in business are going to manage teams of AIs and maybe teams of humans as well. The problem is that I think AI agents have been largely oversold in the last year or so. And there's a lot of guys out there that are essentially just building glorified chatbots without the tool use, without proper memory systems, without good planning, and then without a lot of other stuff like system monitoring, security, system testing, governance, and so on. There are a lot of different ways that AI agents can kind of go bad. And if you don't build these systems properly and test them properly, at best, they can just sort of fail to provide value. And at worst, they can cause a lot of problems. So while I am optimistic about AI agents in the long term, in the short term, I think you should be a little bit cautious about them. Make sure that you are working with reputable consultants and service providers, AI experts. And then also, as we've talked about, you might want to consider other types of AI. Now that you know these four main types of AI, and there are different ones beyond these, but these are the four that I recommend that you know and understand right now. Now that you know these, I want to give you a quick framework for choosing which one to use. Anytime you need to make a precise and accurate prediction, you're probably going to look at a type of predictive AI. If you need to explore your data, especially at scale, and you need sort of precise information about whatever you're trying to do or discover, you're often going to use exploratory AI. Anytime you're working with text-based inputs and are generating text-based outputs or maybe videos or images, anytime you're doing text summarization, question and answer, and things like that, you're probably going to use generative AI. And anytime you're automating a workflow, you're probably going to want to look at AI agents. Having said all of that, there are circumstances when AI might not even be the best solution. So, for example, there are circumstances where AI might work, but it would simply be cheaper to build a traditional software system or maybe even do some more traditional data analysis or data analytics. Part of really winning in business over the next 10 years as we enter into the age of AI is knowing when to use AI and when not to. And then when you do use AI, it's a key skill to know which one to use to solve a particular problem. So now you have a mental map of the four major types of artificial intelligence and a simple framework for how to choose which one. But if you want to win in the age of AI, you'll need to think more carefully about how to integrate AI into your company in a way that drives revenue, profit, and other key metrics. And that's what I'll show you in this next video, how to build an AI first business.